The winter wind howled through the night like a vengeful spirit, rattling the loose boards of Hank Thornton's weathered barn as he finished his evening rounds. It was 1875 in Unionville, Nevada, and the once bustling mining town had grown quieter since the silver veins had thinned, leaving behind only the most stubborn souls. Hank counted himself among them, though he preferred the term resolute to stubborn, a distinction he'd argue with anyone foolish enough to call him the latter, if he ever spoke to folks long enough to hear their opinions. The lantern swinging from his calloused hand cast dancing shadows across the hay-strewn floor as he secured the horses for the night. His boots, worn from years of hard labor, made little sound against the familiar path he'd walked thousands of times before. At 34, Hank's face carried the lines of a man who'd seen his fair share of hardship, his eyes the faded blue of a sun-bleached sky. He'd been alone on this ranch for 7 years now, and the solitude suited him just fine, or so he told himself. "G-night, Diablo," he murmured to his temperamental black stallion, who nickered softly in response. Hank allowed himself a rare half-smile. The animals were the only creatures he conversed with these days, and they had the good sense not to talk back or ask uncomfortable questions. He was about to extinguish his lantern when a sound subtle but foreign to the usual nighttime symphony of his ranch caught his ear. Hank froze, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. Living alone 20 miles from town had taught him caution, and caution had kept him alive. Following the sound to the far corner of the barn, Hank raised his lantern higher, illuminating a small bundle of rags partially hidden behind a stack of hay bales. But as he drew closer, the bundle took human form, a woman, curled tightly into herself against the bitter cold, fast asleep or perhaps unconscious. "What in tarnation?" he breathed, keeping his distance but studying the unexpected intruder. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with tangled chestnut hair framing a face that, even in sleep and smudged with dirt, held a striking loveliness. Her clothes were worn and travel-stained, her boots cracked and mended multiple times. Beside her lay a small satchel, its meager contents spilling out a hairbrush, a tattered book, and a folded paper that looked like a letter. Hank stood rooted to the spot, uncertain what to do. It had been years since he'd had a visitor to his ranch, intentional or otherwise, and longer still since he'd been in the company of a woman. The thought of waking her and demanding explanations made his stomach twist uncomfortably. As if sensing his presence, the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open in momentary confusion before widening in alarm. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the barn wall, her gaze darting around for an escape route. "I don't mean no harm," Hank said gruffly, holding up his free hand in what he hoped was a pacifying gesture, "but you're trespassing on private property." "I'm sorry," she replied, her voice hoarse but carrying a gentle lilt that Hank couldn't place. I needed somewhere to rest for the night. I'll be gone by morning, I promise." Hank studied her face in the lantern light. Fear was evident in her expression, but beneath it was something that struck him even harder, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been running for too long. "You hurt?" he asked, his tone softer than intended. She shook her head, then winced slightly, contradicting her denial. "Nothing serious, just tired." Hank shifted uncomfortably, wrestling with his instincts. 7 years of isolation had made him suspicious of strangers and their motives, but the woman before him looked more desperate than dangerous. And the temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that killed if you were caught outside unprepared. "What's your name?" he asked finally. She hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Willa Zimmerman." "I'm Hank Thornton." He nodded toward the barn door. "My house is just yonder. Got a fire going and some stew left. You can't stay in the barn, too cold tonight." Surprise washed across her features, followed quickly by wariness. "That's kind of you, Mr. Thornton, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not kindness," Hank replied bluntly, "just common sense." Temperatures dropping below freezing tonight, and I don't need a dead body to explain to Sheriff Miller come morning." Willa flinched at his directness, but gathered her meager belongings with shaking hands. Hank noted how she struggled to stand, clearly exhausted beyond measure. For a moment, he considered offering his arm but couldn't bring himself to bridge that physical gap. Instead, he simply raised the lantern higher to light their way. "House isn't far," he said, leading her out into the biting night air. The walk to the cabin was silent save for the crunch of their boots on the frosted ground and Willa's barely suppressed shivers. Hank's home came into view, a solid structure of logs and stone that he'd expanded over the years from the original one-room cabin. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and warm, with smoke curling from the stone chimney into the star-filled Nevada sky. Inside, the warmth of the hearth enveloped them immediately. Hank's cabin was sparse but tidy, with a main room containing a table, 2 chairs, a small sofa covered with a quilt, and a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. A doorway led to what appeared to be his bedroom, and a ladder indicated a loft space above. Willa hovered awkwardly near the door while Hank placed his lantern on the table and added another log to the fire. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to the sofa. "I'll reheat some stew." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the sofa as if prepared to flee at any moment. Hank moved to the cast iron stove in the corner, where a pot of stew sat cooling. As he worked to revive the meal, he caught her taking in her surroundings with curious eyes. "Been on my own here since '68, he said, surprising himself by offering information unprompted. "Ranch belonged to my uncle before that. It's a nice place," Willa replied softly. "Very peaceful." Hank grunted in acknowledgement, though peaceful wasn't the word he would have chosen. Quiet fit better, or perhaps lonely on the days when the silence pressed too heavily against his ears. But he'd chosen this life, hadn't he? After what happened in Virginia City, solitude had seemed the only option. He ladled the steaming stew into a bowl and placed it before her with a chunk of bread. "Eat," he said simply, then retreated to the rocking chair, giving her space. Willa hesitated only briefly before hunger won out over pride or propriety. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, like someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Hank watched from the corner of his eye, pretending to be occupied with cleaning his revolver. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished, her voice stronger now with food in her belly. "I haven't had a hot meal in 3 days." Hank nodded, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. "Where you headed?" "California," she answered, then added with a touch of defiance, "San Francisco." "That's a fair piece from here, especially for a woman traveling alone." Her chin lifted slightly. "I've managed so far." "Barely," Hank observed dryly, nodding toward her exhausted state. "What's waiting in San Francisco that's worth freezing or starving for?" Willa's hands tightened around the empty bowl. "A chance," she said simply. "A fresh start." Something in her tone, a blend of determination and desperation, struck a familiar chord in Hank. Hadn't he come to this isolated ranch seeking the same, a place where the past couldn't find him? "Running from something or running to something?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could think better of it. Her eyes met his, a flash of steel behind the weariness. "Does it matter?" "Suppose not," he conceded, standing to take her bowl. "You can have the loft tonight. There's a bed up there I use for storage mostly, but it'll be warmer than the barn." Relief softened her features. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't need thanks. Just be gone by morning," Hank replied, the words coming out harsher than intended. He saw her flinch and felt an unexpected twinge of regret. "Train passes through Unionville heading west every Tuesday and Friday. That's your best bet for getting closer to California." Willa nodded, gathering her satchel. "Which day is it today?" "Sunday." "You've got a wait ahead of you if that's your plan." Her face fell, clearly calculating the days and her limited resources. Hank showed her to the ladder leading to the loft, handed her a lamp, and retreated to his room without another word. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling. acutely aware of the soft sounds of movement above him, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of bedding, the quiet sigh as she settled. For the first time in years, Hank wasn't alone under his own roof, and the realization was more unsettling than he cared to admit. Morning came with a pallid winter sun and the smell of coffee brewing. Hank opened his eyes, momentarily confused by the domestic sounds coming from his kitchen. Then the events of the previous night flooded back, and he dressed quickly, wondering if his unexpected guest was planning to rob him blind before departing. Instead, he found Willa standing at his stove, her hair tied back neatly, frying eggs in his cast-iron skillet. She'd found his small store of supplies and appeared to be making a genuine effort at breakfast. "Hope you don't mind," she said, glancing over her shoulder as he entered. "Thought I'd make myself useful before heading out." Hank grunted noncommittally, pouring himself a cup of coffee and sitting at the table. He noticed she'd already set out plates and cutlery, his own belongings arranged more neatly than he typically bothered with. "You cook for a living?" he asked as she slid perfectly fried eggs onto his plate, accompanied by some fried potatoes she'd somehow conjured from his meager pantry. "Used to help in the kitchen at a boarding house," she replied, serving herself a smaller portion before joining him at the table. "Learned a few things." They ate in silence for a while, the domesticity of the scene both foreign and strangely comfortable. Hank couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with another person at this table, probably not since his uncle had passed away. "I've been thinking about what you said," Willa ventured after a time. "About the train." Hank looked up, waiting. "I don't have enough money for a ticket to San Francisco," she admitted, her fingers fidgeting with her fork. "I was hoping to find work in Unionville, save up for a while." "Not much work to be had there these days," Hank replied honestly. "Town's dying since the mines started petering out. Those who could leave already have." Disappointment shadowed her face. "I see." Hank took another bite, chewing thoughtfully. The eggs were good, better than the hardtack he often settled for in the mornings, and the woman sitting across from him didn't seem the type to steal or cause trouble. An idea began forming in his mind, one that surprised even him. "I could use some help around here," he found himself saying. "Just temporarily. Been meaning to do some repairs on the east fence line, and it's hard work for one man. Could pay you fair wages, enough for your ticket west in a few weeks' time." Willa's eyes widened. "You do that? Hire me." "It's not charity," Hank clarified quickly. "It's work, hard work." "And you'd stay in the loft, keep to yourself. I value my privacy." "Of course," she nodded eagerly. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Thornton. I'm not afraid of hard work." Hank studied her for a moment. She was thin, yes, but there was a wiry strength to her frame and a determined set to her jaw that suggested she might indeed be tougher than her appearance indicated. "We'll try it for a week," he decided. "If it works out, you can stay until spring when the weather's better for traveling. If not, I'll take you to town myself." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you, I promise I won't be a burden." Hank nodded once, then stood from the table. "Got chores to attend to. When you're done here, meet me in the barn. We'll see what you're capable of." The morning air bit at his face as he crossed the yard to the barn, his breath forming clouds that dissipated in the weak sunlight. What had possessed him to make such an offer? 7 years of careful solitude, and he'd just invited a stranger to share his space for potentially months. The thought should have terrified him, yet alongside the unease was something else, a faint whisper of relief at the prospect of human company. Diablo snorted in greeting as Hank entered the barn, the horse seemingly aware of the change in routine. "Don't get used to it," Hank muttered, patting the stallion's neck. "She'll be gone come spring." He busied himself with the morning feeding, his mind still puzzling over his impulsive decision. It was practical, he told himself. Extra hands meant the work would go faster. Nothing more to it than that. Willa appeared in the barn doorway a half-hour later, her thin coat pulled tight against the cold. "I've finished in the kitchen," she announced. "Everything's washed and put away." Hank nodded, tossing her a pair of work gloves that had shrunk too small for his hands. These might fit. First job is helping with the animals. To her credit, Willa approached the work without complaint. She followed Hank's terse instructions carefully, learning quickly how he preferred things done. By midday, they had completed the morning chores and moved on to repairing a section of the chicken coop that had been damaged in a recent storm. Hank found himself impressed despite his reservations. Willa worked steadily, asking intelligent questions when needed but otherwise keeping to herself. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty and seemed genuinely interested in learning the proper way to do each task. "You've worked on a ranch before?" he asked as they broke for a midday meal of cold sandwiches. Willa shook her head. "No, but my father was a carpenter. I used to help him sometimes before." She trailed off, her expression closing like a door slamming shut. Hank didn't press. Everyone had things they didn't speak of, he certainly did. They finished their meal in silence and returned to work, the rhythm of their shared labor filling the space where conversation might have been. As dusk approached, Hank noticed Willa's pace slowing, her movements becoming stiffer as fatigue set in. She didn't complain, but he could see she was pushing herself to keep up. "That's enough for today," he announced, gathering the tools they'd been using. "Sun's nearly down." Relief flickered across her features before she schooled her expression. "I can continue if there's more to be done." "Work's never done on a ranch," Hank replied, "but there's no sense in working after dark. We'll pick up tomorrow." They walked back to the cabin together, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been that morning. Inside, Willa immediately set about preparing dinner while Hank stoked the fire. The domestic scene felt surreal to him, his solitary routine disrupted by this woman's presence in ways both unsettling and oddly pleasant. "You don't talk much, do you, Mr. Thornton?" Willa observed as they sat down to a simple but satisfying meal of beans, corn bread, and salt pork. Hank raised an eyebrow. "Not much to say." "I find that hard to believe. A man who runs a ranch alone in Nevada must have stories worth telling." "Maybe. But they're my stories to keep," he replied, then relented slightly at the flash of hurt in her eyes. "Been on my own a long while, got out of the habit of conversation." Willa nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. After my father died, I barely spoke for months. Words seemed pointless." The simple admission offered without expectation of reciprocation caught Hank off guard. It was the first personal detail she'd shared willingly, and something about her quiet grief resonated within him. "When did he pass?" he found himself asking. 2 years ago," she replied, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "Influenza took him. After that, I had to find work wherever I could." "And that led you to a barn in Nevada," a small smile touched her lips. "Eventually. It's a long road from Pennsylvania to California." "Pennsylvania," Hank echoed, placing her accent at last. "That explains the way you talk. Is it very noticeable?" she asked, a hint of self-consciousness coloring her tone. "Just different," he assured her. "Not bad different." Their conversation lapsed into silence again, but it felt less strained than before. After dinner, Willa insisted on washing the dishes while Hank retreated to his chair by the fire with a book he'd read a dozen times before. The quiet domestic sounds of her moving about his kitchen created an odd feeling in his chest, not unpleasant, just foreign after so much solitude. When she finished her chores, Willa approached hesitantly. "Would it be all right if I borrowed a book? I noticed you have quite a collection." Hank glanced at the shelves lining one wall of the cabin, his uncle's books mostly, supplemented by volumes he'd picked up on rare trips to town over the years. Reading had been his primary entertainment during the long winter evenings. "Help yourself," he said with a nod. Willa selected a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans and settled on the sofa, tucking her feet beneath her. For the next hour, they read in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional turn of a page. It should have felt intrusive, having another person occupy his space after years alone. Instead, Hank found himself stealing glances at Willa over the top of his book, noting the way the firelight caught in her hair or how her brow furrowed slightly in concentration as she read. When she finally yawned and announced she was retiring for the night, Hank merely nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Long after she had climbed the ladder to the loft, he remained by the fire, contemplating the strange turn his solitary life had taken in the span of 24 hours. The days that followed fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Willa proved to be a quick study and a hard worker, tackling whatever tasks Hank assigned without complaint. She kept the cabin tidier than he ever had, prepared meals that put his basic cooking to shame, and gradually began adding small touches that transformed the sparse interior into something more homelike, a bunch of dried wildflowers on the table, the dishes arranged more neatly on their shelves, his books organized by author rather than haphazardly stacked. Hank pretended not to notice these changes, but secretly, he found himself appreciating the care she took with his home. It had been a long time since anyone had bothered to make things nice for him. Their conversations remained sporadic at first, limited mostly to the work at hand or practical matters. But as the days passed, something began to shift between them. A question here, a shared observation, their small openings that gradually widened into genuine conversation. Hank learned that Willa was 26, the only child of a widowed carpenter. She had worked as a seamstress, a cook's helper, and briefly as a schoolteacher's assistant before deciding to head west. She loved reading, could identify most birds by their calls, and had a surprisingly ribald sense of humor that emerged in rare, unguarded moments. In turn, he found himself sharing small pieces of his own history growing up in Missouri, coming west with his uncle after the war, learning to raise horses and cattle in the harsh Nevada landscape. He didn't mention Virginia City or the events that had driven him into isolation, and Willa seemed to sense the boundaries he wouldn't cross, never pressing when he fell silent or changed the subject abruptly. A week into her stay, a winter storm descended upon the ranch, bringing howling winds and driving snow that made outdoor work impossible. Confined to the cabin, they spent the day on indoor tasks, Hank repairing harnesses and tools while Willa mended clothing and baked bread using the last of his flour. "We'll need to go to town soon," she observed, kneading the dough with practiced hands. "Your pantry's getting bare." Hank grunted in acknowledgement. He typically made the journey to Unionville only once a month, preferring to stock up on supplies and then retreat back to his solitude. The prospect of introducing Willa to the townsfolk made him uneasy for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. "Weather breaks, we'll go," he said finally. "Probably in a couple of days." Willa nodded, her attention seemingly focused on the bread dough, but Hank caught the flash of excitement in her eyes. She must be craving other company by now, he thought with a twinge of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. "Town's not much to look at these days," he warned. "Most businesses have closed up, just the general store, saloon, and a few other establishments hanging on." "Still, it would be nice to see other faces," she admitted. "Though I've enjoyed your company, Mr. Thornton." Hank looked up sharply, searching for signs of mockery, but found only sincerity in her expression. "Suppose you might as well call me Hank," he muttered. "Mr. Thornton makes me feel like my uncle." A smile brightened her features. "Hank, then, and you should call me Willa, not girl or you there like you've been doing." Had he been doing that? Hank felt a flush of embarrassment, force of habit, not used to having names to remember. "Just the one. I think you can manage," she teased gently, turning back to her bread. That evening, with the storm still raging outside, they sat closer to the fire than usual, the temperature in the cabin dropping despite Hank's efforts to keep the blaze fed with logs. Willa had made a hearty stew from the remaining vegetables and some preserved meat, and they ate in contented silence, listening to the wind howl around the cabin's sturdy walls. "Will your animals be all right in this weather?" Willa asked, concern evident in her voice. "Barn's solid." "They'll weather it fine," Hank assured her. Built it to withstand worse than this. You've built a good life here, she observed, her gaze traveling around the cabin. It's not what most people would choose, perhaps, but there's something admirable about creating a place entirely your own. Hank considered her words, surprised by how accurately she'd captured what he valued about his isolated existence. Freedom in it, he agreed. No one to answer to but myself and the land. Do you ever get lonely? The question was soft, tentative, as if she knew she might be overstepping. Hank's first instinct was to dismiss the notion outright, to insist that solitude had been his choice and therefore couldn't be a burden. But something in Willa's gentle inquiry invited honesty. Sometimes, he admitted, staring into the flames. More so in winter when the days are short and the nights stretch on. Summer's easier, too much work to notice the quiet. Willa nodded thoughtfully. I've been lonely in crowded rooms. Sometimes it's worse than being truly alone. How so? Being surrounded by people who look right through you or see only what use you might be to them, she explained, a shadow crossing her face. At least when you're alone by choice, there's dignity in it. The insight struck Hank deeply. He'd never articulated it that way to himself, but she'd captured precisely why he preferred his solitude to the false companionship he'd experienced in town. That why you're heading to San Francisco? He asked. Looking for people who'll see you properly? Partly, she acknowledged. Mostly I'm looking for a place where my past doesn't define me, where I can be Willa Zimmerman, not. She trailed off, her eyes growing distant. Not what? Hank prompted gently. Willa's hands tightened around her mug. Not Thomas Zimmerman's pitiful daughter. Not the desperate young woman who'd take any job, no matter how demeaning. Not the girl who trusted the wrong man and nearly ruined herself completely. The last confession seemed to surprise even her, as if she hadn't intended to reveal so much. She looked away quickly, color rising in her cheeks. I'm sorry, you didn't ask for my troubles. We all got history, Hank said simply, some worse than others. Is that why you're out here, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor? It was Hank's turn to look away. Something like that. To his relief, Willa didn't push further. Instead, she rose and gathered their empty bowls. Thank you for listening. It's been a long time since I felt I could speak freely to anyone. Hank watched her move about the kitchen, struck by how naturally she fit into spaces that had felt empty for years. The realization unsettled him, reminding him that her presence was temporary, a brief interlude in his solitary existence. We should turn in, he said abruptly, standing. Storm might break by morning, lots of work to catch up on if it does. Willa nodded, though she looked momentarily hurt by his sudden withdrawal. Of course. Good night, Hank. Night, Willa, he replied, the sound of her name still unfamiliar on his tongue. In his bedroom, Hank lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm's fury gradually subside to a gentle whisper of snow against the windows. Above him, he could hear Willa moving occasionally in the loft, suggesting she too was finding sleep elusive. What was happening to him? A fortnight ago, he would have scoffed at the idea of sharing his home with a stranger, let alone finding comfort in their presence. Yet here he was, lying awake thinking about a woman sleeping under his roof, wondering about her past and more disturbingly contemplating her future. A future that, by her own admission, lay far from Nevada and his isolated ranch. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into something otherworldly. Hank rose early to check on the animals, trudging through knee-deep drifts to reach the barn. To his surprise, Willa insisted on accompanying him, bundled in an old coat of his that swallowed her smaller frame. You'll freeze out here, he protested, but she merely smiled and followed him out into the brilliant morning light. I've never seen snow so beautiful, she breathed, her face tilted up to catch the sunlight reflecting off the white expanse. In town, it turns to gray slush almost immediately. But here, it's like God laid a fresh tablecloth over the world. Her simple joy in the winter scene was infectious, and Hank found himself seeing the familiar landscape through new eyes. The stark beauty of his ranch had long since become background to him, but Willa's wonder reminded him of his first winter here, when he'd still been capable of awe. They worked together to dig paths to the barn and chicken coop, check on the animals, and assess any damage from the storm. A section of the barn roof had developed a minor leak, and several fence posts had been damaged by the weight of the snow, but overall, the ranch had weathered the storm well. "We'll head to town tomorrow," Hank decided as they returned to the cabin for a late breakfast. "Roads should be passable by then, and we need supplies." Willa's eyes lit up. "I've been meaning to ask, would it be possible for me to send a letter while we're there? I have a friend in San Francisco who's expecting word of my progress." "Post office is still running," Hank nodded. "Though mail coach only comes through once a week now." "Thank you," she said, removing his oversized coat as they entered the warmth of the cabin. "And perhaps I could purchase some fabric. I noticed your shirts could use mending, and I'd like to make myself a new skirt if possible." "I can deduct the cost from my wages." Hank considered refusing the offer. He'd managed with patched clothing for years, but the thought of Willa's nimble fingers repairing his worn garments was strangely appealing. "No need to deduct it," he said gruffly. "Consider it part of your board." The smile she gave him in response warmed something inside him that had been cold for far too long. The journey to Unionville the next day took longer than usual, the wagon moving slowly through the snow-covered terrain. Willa sat beside Hank on the bench seat, bundled against the cold but clearly enjoying the outing. She peppered him with questions about the landscape, the history of the area, and the town they were approaching. "Silver made Unionville for a while," Hank explained, pointing toward the mountains rising in the distance. "Arizona mine was producing good ore through the 60s. Town had nearly 1,000 people at its peak, hotel, newspaper, several saloons." "What happened?" "Silver played out faster than they expected. Those who could moved on to more promising strikes, those who couldn't." He shrugged. "They make do with what's left." As they crested a ridge, Unionville came into view below them, a collection of weathered buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from a handful of chimneys. Even from a distance, the town's diminished circumstances were evident in the abandoned structures and quiet streets. "It's smaller than I expected," Willa observed. "Most of it's abandoned now, about 100 folks still hanging on. Railroad keeps it alive, barely." They continued down into the valley, the wagon wheels creating fresh tracks in the snow-covered road. As they approached the town's main street, Hank felt a familiar tension creep into his shoulders. His infrequent visits to Unionville were typically brief and businesslike supplies, occasional mail, perhaps a quick drink at the saloon before heading back to the solitude of his ranch. Having Willa beside him complicated matters in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. A few curious faces appeared in windows as they passed. Unionville saw few visitors these days, especially in winter, and the sight of Hank Thornton with a woman beside him was certain to spark interest. "News travels fast in small towns," he warned Willa in a low voice. "Folks here aren't used to seeing me with company." She nodded, understanding. "Should I expect questions? Count on it," Hank replied grimly. "Just keep to our arrangement. You're working for me temporarily until you can afford passage to California. Nothing more to it than that." Something flickered in Willa's eyes, disappointment perhaps, but she nodded again. "Of course." They pulled up outside Donovan's General Store, the largest remaining business in Unionville. Hank helped Willa down from the wagon, acutely aware of her gloved hand in his and the questioning stares of the few people on the street. "Hank Thornton, as I live and breathe." A booming voice called as they approached the store. "Twice in 1 month we're honored indeed." The speaker was Michael Donovan himself, a barrel-chested Irishman with a shock of white hair and the only successful merchant left in Unionville. He stood in the doorway of his establishment, eyes twinkling with undisguised curiosity as they fixed on Willa. "Storm cleared out my supplies faster than expected," Hank explained, his tone making it clear he wasn't interested in elaboration. Of course, Donovan nodded, his gaze never leaving Willa. And who might this lovely lady be? Willa Zimmerman, she replied before Hank could speak, extending her hand. I'm working for Mr. Thornton temporarily while making my way west. A pleasure, Miss Zimmerman, Donovan said, taking her hand with more enthusiasm than Hank thought necessary. Any friend of our resident hermit is a welcome sight in Unionville. Hank scowled at the characterization but held his tongue as they entered the store. Inside, the shelves were less fully stocked than they had been during his last visit, but the essentials were available: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, and dry goods. A small selection of fabric and notions occupied one corner, where two women were already browsing. Ladies, Donovan called to them, come meet Miss Zimmerman, who's staying out at Thornton's place. The women turned with poorly concealed eagerness, their eyes sweeping over Willa with open assessment. Hank recognized them as Martha Collins, the preacher's wife, and her daughter Sarah, a pretty young woman of about 20. How interesting, Martha said, her tone suggesting she found it scandalous rather than merely interesting. What sort of work brings you to Mr. Thornton's establishment? The emphasis on the last word made Hank's jaw tighten, but Willa responded with calm dignity. Ranch work mostly. Mr. Thornton has been kind enough to offer employment while I save for my journey to California. I'm an experienced cook and seamstress as well. Indeed, Martha replied, clearly not entirely satisfied with this explanation but unwilling to press further in public. Well, Unionville welcomes you, limited though our amenities may be. Thank you, Willa said with a polite smile. I was actually hoping to find some fabric. I need to make a new skirt and perhaps mend some items. Sarah Collins brightened at this. Oh, Mr. Donovan just got in some lovely calico last week. I'd be happy to show you. As the women moved toward the fabric section, Hank turned to Donovan with his list of supplies, grateful for the separation. He could hear the murmur of female voices as he conducted his business, occasionally catching Willa's gentle laugh or Sarah's more animated tones. She seems a fine young woman, Donovan observed casually as he tallied Hank's purchases. Quite a change from your usual solitary ways. It's a business arrangement, Hank stated flatly. She needed work, I needed help, nothing more to it. Donovan raised a skeptical eyebrow but knew better than to challenge Hank directly. Of course. Though I should warn you, Martha Collins is already planning to mention this arrangement to her husband. Preacher might have concerns about propriety. Hank's expression darkened. What happens on my property is my business, not the preacher's. Just giving you fair warning, Donovan shrugged. Small town, you know how it is. Unfortunately, Hank did know. It was one of the many reasons he preferred his isolated ranch to town life. People's tendency to meddle in affairs that didn't concern them ranked high among his grievances with humanity in general. By the time he'd finished his transactions, Willa had selected several lengths of fabric, thread, and other sewing necessities. She also held a small package of hard candies, which she placed on the counter with an almost guilty expression. A small luxury, she explained when Hank raised an eyebrow. I'll pay for it from my wages. Add it to my account, Hank told Donovan, ignoring Willa's protest. And these too. He placed a pair of women's gloves beside her purchases, practical leather work gloves lined with wool, far sturdier than the thin ones she'd been wearing. Willa looked at him in surprise. That's not necessary. Your hands are blistering from the work, Hank said matter-of-factly. Can't have my hired help unable to use their hands. A soft smile curved her lips. Thank you. After settling his account with Donovan, Hank led Willa to the small post office adjacent to the general store. The postmaster, an elderly man named Jenkins who'd held the position since before the silver bust, perked up at the sight of customers. Well now, Hank Thornton and a lady friend, what can I do for you today? Miss Zimmerman has a letter to send, Hank replied curtly. While Willa conducted her postal business, Hank waited outside, nodding tersely to the few townsfolk who passed by. Most knew better than to engage him in conversation, though he caught several curious glances and whispered comments that undoubtedly concerned his female companion. "One more stop," he told Willa when she emerged. "Need to check with the blacksmith about some work I need done." They walked down the snow-covered Main Street, past buildings that had once housed thriving businesses but now stood empty, their windows boarded up and their signs faded. Unionville's decline was evident in every sagging porch and peeling paint job. The blacksmith shop, at least, showed signs of activity, smoke billowing from its forge chimney. Inside, the heat was intense after the winter chill, and the rhythmic sound of hammer on metal filled the air. "Thornton," called a deep voice from the gloom. The blacksmith, Caleb Marsh, set aside his hammer and approached, wiping soot-covered hands on his leather apron. He was a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a beard that reached mid-chest. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Willa. "Well now, what have we here?" he asked, his tone good-natured but curious. Hank made brief introductions while explaining the work he needed done, repairs to some specialized tools and horseshoes for Diablo, whose temperament made him impossible for anyone but Hank to handle. While the men discussed the details, Willa wandered around the shop, examining the various implements and metalworks with interest. She paused before a small display of decorative items, candlesticks, kitchen hooks, and ornamental brackets that showcased Marsh's more artistic talents. "These are beautiful," she commented, running a finger along an intricately designed candle holder. Marsh beamed with pride. "Thank you, miss. Don't get much call for the fancy work these days, but I keep my hand in." "You're very skilled," Willa said sincerely, and Hank noticed how the blacksmith straightened at her praise, his chest puffing slightly. "Got time for a drink before heading back?" Marsh asked Hank as they concluded their business. "Saloon's quiet this time of day." Hank hesitated, glancing at Willa. He typically allowed himself one whiskey during his town visits, but bringing Willa into the Silverado saloon didn't seem appropriate. She sensed his dilemma. "I could wait at the general store," she offered. "Sarah Collins mentioned some books they keep for sale or trade. I wouldn't mind browsing." Relief and something like disappointment warred within Hank. "Won't be long," he promised, watching as she made her way back toward Donovan's store. The Silverado was indeed quiet when Hank and Marsh entered, with only a handful of patrons nursing drinks at the scarred bar or playing desultory card games at the tables. The bartender, a man named Wilson who'd been pouring drinks in Unionville for 2 decades, raised his eyebrows at Hank's entrance. "Twice in 1 month, Thornton. The world must be ending." Hank ignored the comment, ordering whiskey for himself and Marsh. They took their drinks to a corner table where the blacksmith wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "So, the mysterious Miss Zimmerman, where'd you find her?" "She found me," Hank replied shortly, taking a sip of his drink. "Needed work, I needed help. Simple as that." Marsh chuckled. "Nothing's ever that simple with a woman involved, especially one as pretty as that. Town's already buzzing about it. Bet Preacher Collins will be paying you a visit before long to inquire about the state of her virtue under your roof." Hank's grip tightened on his glass. "What happens on my property is your business, I know," Marsh finished for him. "But you know how folk talk, especially in a dying town where entertainment's scarce." "Let them talk," Hank muttered, though the prospect of becoming gossip fodder rankled. "She seems a decent sort," Marsh observed. "Educated, too, by her speech, not the usual type looking for ranch work. She's passing through. Heading to California once she earns enough." Something in Hank's tone must have betrayed him because Marsh studied him with newfound interest. "And how do you feel about that plan, old friend?" "Not my concern," Hank replied too quickly. "She's free to go where she pleases." Marsh nodded slowly, unconvinced. "Of course. Though it might be nice having someone around permanently, that ranch of yours is too big for one man." "I've managed fine." "Surviving ain't the same as living, Hank," Marsh said quietly. What happened in Virginia City, we don't speak of that, Hank cut him off sharply, draining his whiskey in one burning swallow. Ever. Marsh raised his hands in surrender. Just saying, maybe it's time to let the past stay in the past. 7 years is a long time to punish yourself. Hank stood abruptly. Need to get back before dark. Thanks for the drink. As he strode from the saloon, Marsh's words echoed uncomfortably in his mind. Was that what he'd been doing all these years? Punishing himself? The thought had never occurred to him in quite those terms, but it carried a ring of truth that disturbed his carefully maintained equilibrium. He found Willa exactly where she said she'd be, engrossed in a book at the general store while Sarah Collins chattered beside her. Both women looked up at his entrance, Sarah falling silent mid-sentence. "Ready?" he asked Willa. She nodded, returning the book to its shelf with visible reluctance. "It was lovely meeting you, Sarah. Thank you for your company." "You must come to church on Sunday," Sarah insisted, glancing at Hank. "Both of you, Father would be so pleased, and we have a small gathering afterward with refreshments." "That's very kind," Willa replied diplomatically, "but it's quite a journey from Mr. Thornton's ranch." "Perhaps another time," Hank added, knowing full well there would be no other time. He hadn't set foot in Unionville's church in 7 years and had no intention of breaking that streak. They collected their purchases and loaded the wagon, Willa waving goodbye to Sarah and Donovan as they pulled away from the store. The sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. "Did you get everything you needed?" Hank asked as they left the town behind. "Yes, thank you. Everyone was very welcoming." There was a slight hesitation in her voice that caught his attention. But Willa sighed softly. "There were questions about our arrangement, nothing direct, just implications." Hank's jaw tightened. "Figured as much. Small town minds tend toward the gutter." "It's all right," she assured him. "I've dealt with worse, though I think Mrs. Collins was scandalized by the idea of me staying in your home unchaperoned." "Wouldn't be the first time Eleanor Collins found cause to be scandalized by my conduct," Hank muttered. Willa looked at him curiously. "You have a history with the preacher's wife, not the kind you're thinking," Hank clarified. "She just appointed herself moral guardian of Unionville years ago. Been looking down her nose at me since I first arrived." "Why? You seem perfectly respectable to me." The innocent observation brought an unexpected warmth to Hank's cheeks. "Let's just say I don't fit her idea of a God-fearing citizen. Don't attend church, don't socialize, don't seek her approval." "Unforgivable sins, clearly," Willa teased gently. Hank found himself smiling despite the lingering irritation. "Damned beyond redemption, according to Eleanor." "Then we're well matched in our social exile," Willa said with a soft laugh. I could tell she wasn't sure what to make of me either. The phrase, well-matched, lingered in Hank's mind as they continued their journey home, the wagon wheels cutting through fresh snow as the winter sun cast the landscape in golden light. Well-matched. It was a dangerous notion, one that suggested permanence rather than the temporary arrangement they'd agreed upon. Yet as he glanced at Willa beside him, her face flushed with cold and a contentment he hadn't seen before, Hank found himself wondering what it might be like if she stayed beyond spring. If the ranch became her home as it had become his, the thought should have terrified him. Instead, it settled in his chest with unexpected warmth, like embers waiting to be coaxed into flame. The weeks following their trip to town established a new rhythm to life on the ranch. The winter deepened, bringing shorter days and longer nights spent in the warmth of the cabin. Willa proved herself indispensable, not just with the daily chores, but in the small ways she improved their shared existence. Bread baked fresh every few days, meals that actually had flavor beyond salt and heat. The cabin kept cleaner and more organized than Hank had ever bothered with. With the fabric she'd purchased, Willa made herself a new skirt and set about mending Hank's worn clothing. He found it strange at first, watching her nimble fingers work on his shirts and pants in the evenings, but gradually came to appreciate both the repairs and the comfortable domesticity of their fireside routine. For her part, Willa seemed to genuinely enjoy ranch life. She tackled new tasks with enthusiasm, learning to milk the cows, feed the chickens, and even assist with the horses, though Diablo remained wary of anyone but Hank. She was particularly taken with a young filly born the previous spring, spending extra time brushing her coat and offering treats until the horse would come running at the sound of her voice. "She needs a name," Willa insisted one afternoon as they watched the filly prance around the corral. "Been calling her Spring," Hank shrugged. Willa wrinkled her nose. "That's not a proper name. She needs something that suits her spirit." "Such as Mariposa," Willa declared after a moment's consideration. "It means butterfly in Spanish. See how she moves. Like she might take flight at any moment." Hank watched the filly's graceful movements and had to admit there was something fitting about the name. "Mariposa it is, then." The smile Willa gave him in response was radiant, and Hank felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained for so long. These small moments of connection were becoming more frequent between them, brief instances where the barriers he'd constructed seemed to thin. Their conversations grew longer and more personal as the winter progressed. Sitting before the fire in the evenings, they gradually exchanged pieces of their histories. Willa spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's carpentry shop, the simple but happy life they'd led before his death. "He taught me to read when I was 4, she recalled one night, her eyes distant with memory. "Said a woman with a mind full of books would never truly be poor." "Wise man," Hank commented, thinking of his own modest library. "He would have liked you," she said unexpectedly. He respected people who built things with their hands and lived by their own rules. The observation touched Hank more deeply than he cared to admit. "What happened after he died?" Willa's expression clouded. "I tried to keep his shop going, but people didn't want to buy furniture from a woman. Said I couldn't possibly know the craft properly." Bitterness edged her voice. "I sold what I could and took a position at Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house, cooking, cleaning, whatever was needed. That where you learn to cook," she nodded. "Mrs. Hargrove was demanding but fair. I might have stayed, but then—" She trailed off, her hands tightening in her lap. "But then," Hank prompted gently, "her son returned from back east, Charles Hargrove." Willa's voice had gone flat. "He took an interest in me. At first I was flattered he was educated, handsome, from a good family. He spoke of marriage, of taking me away from service." Hank could guess where this story was heading, and anger stirred in his chest. "He lied," Willa continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I discovered he was already engaged to a banker's daughter in Philadelphia. When I confronted him, She swallowed hard. "He said a girl in my position should be grateful for whatever attention a man like him might bestow, that no respectable man would want me for a wife anyway." "Bastard," Hank growled. "I left that night. Couldn't bear to stay under the same roof, knowing Mrs. Hargrove would believe her son over me if it came to it. I'd saved a little money, enough to start moving west. I've been working my way across the country ever since, staying nowhere long enough to put down roots." The vulnerability in her confession stirred something protective in Hank. Man like that isn't worth fleeing across a continent for. "It wasn't just him," Willa admitted. "After that, rumors spread. My reputation was questioned. In a small town, that's a death sentence for a woman's prospects. I realized I needed a fresh start somewhere no one knew my name or past." Hank understood that impulse all too well. Wasn't that exactly what had driven him to this isolated ranch? The desire to escape judgment, to reinvent oneself where the past couldn't follow. "Your turn," Willa said softly. "Fair exchange." Hank stiffened. He'd shared bits and pieces of his early life, but had carefully avoided any mention of Virginia City or the events that had led him to his self-imposed exile. "Not much to tell," he demurred. "I don't believe that," Willa replied, her gaze steady. "Something brought you to this ranch, something keeps you here alone. You don't have to tell me everything, but I'd like to know you better, Hank." The simple honesty in her request broke through defenses he'd maintained for years. Perhaps it was the firelight, or the quiet intimacy of the moment, or simply the weeks of gradual trust building between them, but Hank found himself speaking of things he'd sworn never to discuss. "I wasn't always a rancher," he began haltingly. "After the war, I drifted west with my uncle. He'd been in California during the gold rush, knew something about mining. We ended up in Virginia City when the Comstock lode was booming." Willa listened intently as he described those early days, the wild energy of a silver boomtown, the fortune hunters and gamblers, the feeling that anything was possible. "Uncle Thomas bought this land as an investment, but I was caught up in the mining fever. Worked my way up from basic labor to shift boss at the Collar mine." Pride crept into his voice despite himself. "Good money, respected position. Had plans to invest in my own claim eventually." "What changed?" Willa asked softly when he fell silent. Hank's jaw tightened. This was the part he never spoke of, the memories he'd tried to bury beneath years of solitude and hard work. "There was a woman," he said finally, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. "Elizabeth Reed, daughter of one of the mine owners, beautiful, educated, everything I wasn't. But somehow she saw something in me worth her time." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "We courted for nearly a year. I was saving for a ring, planning to ask her father's permission. Then there was an accident at the mine." The memories flooded back with painful clarity, the shouts, the rumble of timber giving way, the choking dust and darkness. "Cave entrapped 16 men on my shift. I was up top when it happened, organizing the rescue. We worked for 2 days straight digging them out." His voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Lost 7 men. Good men with families." "That's terrible," Willa said gently, "but surely you weren't blamed. These things happen in mining." "Official inquiry cleared me of wrongdoing," Hank acknowledged. "But rumors started suggestions I'd ignored warning signs, cut corners on timbering to increase production. Elizabeth's father believed them, or at least had doubts enough to forbid her from seeing me." "And Elizabeth? What did she think?" Hank's expression hardened. "She said she believed me at first, said we'd weather it together. Then suddenly she was engaged to the bank manager's son. Convenient timing." "I'm sorry," Willa murmured. After that, town felt poisoned. "Couldn't walk down the street without feeling eyes on me, wondering if I was responsible for those deaths. Uncle Thomas had passed by then, left me this place. Seemed like a sign to start fresh." "So you came here to escape the gossip," Willa summarized. "But 7 years is a long time to punish yourself for something that wasn't your fault." The echo of Marsh's words from the saloon startled Hank. "Who says I'm punishing myself? Aren't you?" Willa challenged gently. "Living alone, avoiding connections, as if you don't deserve human companionship because of what happened." Her perception was uncomfortably accurate. Hank had never articulated it to himself in those terms, but there was truth in her assessment that he couldn't deny. "Maybe at first," he admitted. "But after a while it just became easier, simpler. No expectations to meet, no one to disappoint. No one to hurt you," Willa added softly. Their eyes met across the space between them, a moment of perfect understanding passing between two people who had retreated from the world for different reasons but with similar wounds. "Does it get lonely?" she asked, echoing her question from weeks before but with new depth. This time, Hank didn't equivocate. "Yes," he said simply. "It does." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than any detailed confession might have been. Willa reached across the space between them, her hand coming to rest lightly on his. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "For trusting me with your story." Hank looked down at their hands, hers small and pale against his weather-roughened skin, and felt something shift irrevocably inside him. The walls he'd so carefully constructed were crumbling, brick by brick, and he lacked the will or desire to rebuild them. February brought a temporary thaw, allowing them to tackle outdoor projects that had been impossible during the depths of winter. Hank found himself impressed anew by Willa's determination and quick learning. She approached each task with intelligence and care, never complaining about the physical demands despite her slender frame. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a section of fence that had collapsed under the weight of snow, Hank paused to watch her drive a nail with precise, confident strokes. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing her adopt the skills he'd taught her, about the way she'd integrated herself into the life of the ranch. "You're good at this," he observed. "Natural talent for it." Willa smiled, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cool air. "I told you my father was a carpenter. I used to help him sometimes when he'd let me. He taught you well." "He'd be pleased to hear you say so," she replied, her expression softening with memory. "He always said I should have been born a son the way I took to his tools." Hank watched her return to her work, struck by how at ease she seemed in this rugged setting. It was hard to reconcile the capable woman before him with the exhausted figure he'd found in his barn months ago. She'd blossomed here, gaining strength and confidence with each passing day. The thought that she would eventually leave for California had begun to create an ache in his chest that he couldn't ignore. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, to shared meals and conversations, to the sound of her humming as she worked, to the way she'd transformed his solitary existence into something richer and more meaningful, more than accustomed, if he was being honest with himself. He'd grown to depend on her. That evening, after a simple but satisfying dinner, Hank cleared his throat awkwardly. "Been meaning to ask how are your savings coming along for your ticket west?" Willa looked up from her mending, surprise evident in her expression. "Oh. Well, with room and board covered, I've been able to save most of what you've paid me. I should have enough by April, I think." April. The word landed like a stone in Hank's stomach. That was less than 2 months away. "No rush," he found himself saying. "Work picks up in spring. Could use the help through calving season if you're willing." Hope flickered across Willa's features. "You'd want me to stay longer, if it suits you," Hank replied, trying to keep his tone casual despite the importance of the question. "Pays the same, of course. Might even be able to increase it a bit with the spring cattle sales coming." "I'd like that," Willa said softly. "I've come to enjoy it here." Relief washed through Hank, though he knew he was only delaying the inevitable. Sooner or later she would continue her journey west. But for now, he had been granted a reprieve. "Good," he nodded, returning his attention to the book in his lap, though the words swam meaninglessly before his eyes. "That's settled then." The next day, Hank rode into town alone to check on the progress of his order with the blacksmith. He told himself it was practical, someone needed to stay with the animals, and the day promised to turn stormy, but in truth, he wanted to avoid the gossip that would inevitably accompany another visit with Willa at his side. Marsh greeted him with knowing eyes as he entered the forge. "No Miss Zimmerman today. Ranch doesn't run itself," Hank replied curtly. "My tool's ready, just finishing up." Marsh gestured toward a workbench where the repaired implements lay. "How's domestic life treating you, old friend?" Hank shot him a warning glance. "It's a working arrangement, nothing more." "Of course," Marsh replied, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "That why you're scowling like a man facing the gallows rather than one with a pretty woman keeping his house?" "She's leaving come spring," Hank said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Heading to California as planned." Marsh studied him with unexpected perception. "And that troubles you?" It wasn't a question, and Hank didn't bother denying it. "She has her reasons for going. Not my place to stand in her way." "Have you considered there might be reasons to stay? If someone gave her cause?" Hank busied himself examining the repaired tools, avoiding Marsh's probing gaze. "She's had enough men making decisions about her life. Won't be another." "There's a difference between making decisions for someone and letting them know they have options," Marsh pointed out. "Woman can't consider staying if she doesn't know she's wanted." The simple truth of this observation struck Hank forcefully. He'd been so careful to maintain the pretense of their business arrangement, to respect the boundaries between them, that he'd never given Willa any indication that her presence had become essential to him. "Something to think about," Marsh added when Hank remained silent. before she boards that westbound train. The ride back to the ranch gave Hank ample time to consider Marsh's words. Could he ask Willa to stay? Did he have the right? And more importantly, what exactly was he offering? Employment was the simplest answer, but it wasn't the whole truth, not anymore. The sky darkened as he approached the ranch, heavy clouds gathering overhead and the wind picking up ominously. By the time he reached the barn, the first fat raindrops were falling, quickly intensifying into a driving downpour. Willa appeared at the barn door as he dismounted, her hair damp from a brief exposure to the storm. "You made it back just in time," she called over the rising wind. "Weather turned faster than I expected." "Saw it coming," Hank replied, leading his horse inside. "Got everything secured. Chickens are in, cows are in the small pasture by the creek. I was just checking the barn roof for leaks when I heard you approach." Her competence should have come as no surprise by now, but Hank found himself impressed anew. "You've become quite the rancher," he observed, a note of pride in his voice. Willa smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I had a good teacher." They worked together to stable his horse and ensure the barn was secure against the strengthening storm. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof and creating small rivers in the yard between the barn and the cabin. "We'll have to make a run for it," Hank said, eyeing the distance to the house. "Ready." Willa nodded, and they dashed through the downpour, arriving at the cabin breathless and soaked despite the short distance. Inside, the fire had died down but still provided some warmth as they shed their wet outer garments. "I'll get this built up again," Willa said, moving to tend the fire while Hank hung their wet coats near the door. As she knelt before the hearth, adding kindling and coaxing the embers back to life, Hank found himself watching the graceful movements of her hands, the way the firelight caught in her damp hair. She had changed in the months since he'd found her in his barn. Her face had filled out, losing the gaunt look of hardship, and her skin had taken on a healthy glow despite the winter pallor that affected them both. But the most striking change was in her demeanor. The wariness that had marked her in those early days had largely disappeared, replaced by a quiet confidence. She moved through his home, their home, as he'd begun to think of it with comfortable familiarity, as if she belonged there, and perhaps she did. "Marsh sends his regards," Hank said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Willa looked up from the now crackling fire. "That was kind of him. How was town?" "Same as always. Donovan mentioned new fabric coming in next month, thought you might be interested." He hesitated, then added, "For your new life in California." Something flickered across Willa's face, disappointment. "Resignation?" "That's thoughtful," she said after a moment, "though I'm not sure how much sewing I'll be doing in San Francisco. I was hoping to find work as a teacher's assistant again. I've always enjoyed working with children." "You'd be good at it," Hank said honestly. The thought of Willa surrounded by city children, sharing her knowledge and gentle spirit, created a bittersweet ache in his chest. "Do you ever think about having a family?" she asked unexpectedly. "Children of your own?" The question caught Hank off guard. "Used to," he admitted after a moment. "Back in Virginia City when things were different. And now." He met her gaze across the room, feeling as though they were suddenly discussing something far more immediate than theoretical futures. "Didn't seem likely, living out here alone." "But if you weren't alone," Willa pressed, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. Hank's heart began beating faster, sensing they were approaching some precipice. "Depends on who was doing the sharing, I suppose." The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves of the cabin. "I've been thinking," Willa said finally, her voice almost lost beneath the storm's fury. "About my plans." Hank held his breath, afraid to hope. "California," she nodded slowly. "I've been running for so long, moving from place to place, never letting myself get attached. It became a habit, I think. The idea of finally stopping somewhere felt dangerous." "And now?" Hank asked, his voice rough with emotion. Willa's eyes met his, vulnerability and determination mingling in her gaze. Now I'm wondering if I've already found what I was looking for, if perhaps I don't need to go all the way to California to start a new life. Hank's chest tightened with a hope so fierce it was almost painful. Unionville's hardly San Francisco, he said cautiously. Not much opportunity there. I wasn't thinking of Unionville, Willa replied softly. The meaning behind her words was unmistakable, yet Hank found himself paralyzed with uncertainty. After so many years of solitude, of carefully maintained distance from others, the prospect of acknowledging what had grown between them was terrifying. Yet the alternative, watching Willa board that westbound train, knowing he'd let her go without speaking the truth, was infinitely worse. I'm not an easy man, he said finally, his voice barely audible over the storm. Set in my ways after so long alone, probably a poor excuse for company most days. A smile curved Willa's lips. I've noticed. Ranch life is hard, isolated, long winters, endless work. I'm aware of that too. Hank took a step toward her, then another, closing the physical distance between them as he had been gradually closing the emotional distance these past months. Despite all that, I'd like you to stay, Willa, not as hired help. As, words failed him, but Willa didn't need them. She rose from her place by the fire, meeting him halfway across the room. As what, Hank? She prompted gently, her eyes searching his. As my wife, he said simply, if you'll have me. For one terrible moment, Willa's expression remained unreadable, and Hank feared he had misinterpreted everything. Then her face transformed with a joy so radiant it took his breath away. Yes, she whispered, reaching for his hands. Yes, I will have you, Hank Thornton. The last of Hank's reservations crumbled as he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucking beneath his chin as if made to rest there. I've been falling in love with you since that first morning when you made breakfast in my kitchen, he confessed against her hair. Just took this stubborn old heart time to recognize it. Willa laughed softly, the sound vibrating against his chest. And I've been falling in love with you since you offered me shelter that night in the barn, even with your gruff manner and suspicious eyes. Hank pulled back slightly to look at her, marveling at the transformation of his life in the span of a few short months. From solitude to this, a woman in his arms who saw him clearly, past and all, and chose him anyway. I don't have a ring, he realized suddenly, nothing proper to offer. We'll go to town when the weather clears, Willa assured him, though I don't need a ring to know my own mind or heart. Eleanor Collins will have opinions about this development, Hank warned, though he found he cared far less about town gossip than he once had. Let her, Willa replied with unexpected fierceness. I've spent too long worrying what others think. This is our life, our choice. Her confidence strengthened his own resolve. We'll need to expand the cabin, he mused, already thinking practically. Add a proper bedroom for us, maybe a small room for, he stopped, suddenly uncertain, for children, Willa finished softly. I'd like that, not immediately perhaps, but someday. The thought of children, their children running across the ranch that had known only his solitary footsteps for so long filled Hank with a joy he'd never anticipated. A family, he said, testing the word that had seemed forever beyond his reach. A family, Willa echoed, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin's sturdy walls, something new had taken root, a love born of shared work and quiet evenings, of painful pasts and hopeful futures, of two lonely souls who had found in each other not just companionship but home. Hank lowered his head slowly, giving Willa time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she rose on tiptoe to meet him, her lips finding his in a kiss that felt like both beginning and completion. His hands cradled her face gently, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held, which he realized she was. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, the storm outside had begun to abate, as if nature itself acknowledged the peace they had found within. What happens now? Willa asked, Her hands still resting against his chest, Hank smiled, a full, unguarded expression that transformed his weathered features. Now we build a life together, one day at a time, and that is exactly what they did. Spring arrived with its usual riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. The snow melted, revealing green shoots pushing through the softening earth, and the ranch came alive with the sounds of newborn calves and the busy preparations for the growing season. Hank and Willa were married on a clear April morning in Unionville's small church, causing a sensation among the townsfolk who had speculated endlessly about their relationship. Eleanor Collins wore an expression of pinched disapproval throughout the ceremony, but her husband performed the service with genuine warmth, having been won over by Willa's gentle manner and obvious devotion to the town's most notorious recluse. Sarah Collins served as Willa's attendant, delighted to be part of such a romantic occasion, while Marsh stood as Hank's best man, beaming with satisfaction at having his predictions confirmed. "Told you she might stay if given proper incentive," he muttered to Hank as they waited for Willa to appear. "Shut up and hand me the ring when asked," Hank replied, though without heat. The ring in question was a simple gold band purchased from Donovan's store, nothing fancy, but solid and enduring, like the commitment it represented. When Hank placed it on Willa's finger, his hands trembled slightly, still amazed that this moment had come to pass. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Preacher Collins declared, and the small gathering of witnesses broke into spontaneous applause, genuinely pleased to see happiness come to one of their own, even one as standoffish as Hank Thornton had been. They returned to the ranch that same day, declining offers of a celebration in town. Their home, truly theirs now, in every sense welcomed them with familiar comfort, but transformed by their new status and the knowledge that this was no temporary arrangement but the beginning of a shared life. In the months that followed, they worked side by side to expand the cabin as planned, adding a proper bedroom and a small study that could eventually become a nursery. Hank taught Willa everything he knew about ranching, while she introduced refinements to their daily life that made the isolated existence more comfortable. Word spread about the quality of Thornton beef and the excellent horses they were raising, bringing more business their way. Hank found himself gradually becoming less reclusive, more willing to engage with visitors to the ranch, and even, on occasion, to accompany Willa to town for supplies or social gatherings. "Never thought I'd see the day when Hank Thornton voluntarily attended a town picnic," Marsh commented during the 4th of July celebration, watching as Willa chatted with Sarah Collins and other townswomen nearby. "Neither did I," Hank admitted, his eyes rarely leaving his wife's figure. "Things change. For the better, I'd say," Marsh observed, noting the contentment that had replaced the brooding intensity in his friend's demeanor. "You're a lucky man, Hank. Don't I know it?" Hank replied with simple honesty. In the fall, they took their first trip beyond Unionville together, traveling to Carson City for supplies and to visit a renowned horse breeder whose bloodlines Hank was interested in acquiring for their expanding herd. The journey reminded Willa of her interrupted travels west, but without the desperation that had marked that earlier time. "Do you ever regret not continuing to San Francisco?" Hank asked as they sat on the hotel balcony, watching the more cosmopolitan city life unfold below them. Willa considered the question seriously. "I wondered if I might," she admitted. "But no, I think I was running towards something I already found with you, a place to belong, work that matters, a chance to build something lasting." Her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen, a gesture that did not escape Hank's notice. "Willa," he asked, hope and trepidation mingling in his voice. Her smile confirmed his suspicion before her words could. "I wanted to be sure before I told you. The doctor in Unionville confirmed it last week. We're going to have a baby, Hank. Next spring." Joy surged through him with such force that for a moment he couldn't speak. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair to hide the tears that sprang to his eyes. "A baby," he whispered when he found his voice again. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Willa asked, though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Hank replied, placing a gentle hand over hers where it rested on her still flat stomach. "Thank you for giving me a family, Willa, for choosing to stay." "Thank you for finding me in your barn that night," she countered softly, "for awakening my heart when I thought it was safer to keep it dormant." Their lips met in a tender kiss. Sealed with the promise of the future, they were creating together a future neither had dared to imagine in their solitary pasts. The following May, as wildflowers again carpeted the Nevada landscape, Willa gave birth to a son they named Thomas James Thornton, in honor of both their fathers. The baby had Hank's blue eyes and Willa's determined chin, a perfect blending of his parents that delighted them both. "He's going to be stubborn," Willa observed as she nursed him in the rocking chair by the fireplace, the same chair where Hank had sat alone for so many years before her arrival. "With us as parents, guaranteed," Hank agreed, watching the scene with undisguised wonder. Poor child never stood a chance. Little Thomas thrived on the ranch, growing from a solemn infant into a curious toddler who followed his father everywhere, determined to help with chores far beyond his capabilities. Willa divided her time between caring for their son, managing the household, and continuing to work alongside Hank when possible. They employed a local boy to help with the heavier ranch work, allowing them more family time together. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Emma Rose, completing their family in a way that felt perfect to them both. Their home, once so silent and empty, now rang with children's laughter and the everyday sounds of family life. On winter evenings, when the children were tucked into bed and the fire burned low, Hank and Willa would often sit together, her head resting against his shoulder as they talked softly about the day's events or plans for the future. "You ever miss your solitude?" Willa asked one such night 5 years into their marriage. The quiet, the freedom to please only yourself, Hank considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he admitted, "but never enough to trade what we have now, not for a moment," and it was true. The loneliness that had once been his constant companion was now a distant memory, replaced by the rich complexity of family life, its challenges and frustrations alongside its immeasurable joys. "What about you?" he asked in return. "Ever wish you'd continued west, seen the ocean, lived the city life?" Willa smiled, the same radiant smile that had captivated him from the beginning. "I found my ocean right here," she said, gesturing to the life they'd built together. "Vast and deep and full of wonders I'm still discovering." Hank pulled her closer, marveling at how the woman he'd found sleeping in his barn had transformed not just his life but his very self. The reclusive cowboy was still there in his preference for open spaces over crowds, in his occasional need for solitude, but he was no longer defined by his isolation or his past. "I love you, Willa Thornton," he said simply. "And I love you," she replied, the words as true and necessary as breath itself. Now and always. Outside their window, snow began to fall, covering the ranch in a blanket of pristine white much as it had the night they first met. But now, instead of emphasizing Hank's solitude, it merely highlighted the warmth of the home they had created together, a sanctuary built on second chances, and the courage to trust again after heartbreak. In finding each other, they had each found themselves not in spite of their pasts but because of them. Every hardship and disappointment leading inexorably to that winter night when a reclusive cowboy found a woman sleeping in his barn, and 2 lonely hearts began their journey toward healing, toward home.